Welcome to these three webinars being organised by the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University in conjunction with the Oxford Review of Economic Policy. My name is Colin. I'm Professor of Management Studies at the Saïd Business School in Oxford, and together with Paul Collier, who's Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School, we are hosting these webinars on the future of capitalism. In each of the webinars, there are two authors who are contributing articles to a forthcoming special issue of the Oxford Review of Economic Policy on capitalism, edited by Paul and me, together with Professor Diane Coyle, who is Professor of Public Policy at Cambridge University, and Martin Wolf, who is Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times. There are a total of 19 eminent authors from different parts of the world contributing 17 papers to the issue of the Oxford Review. Each author has been asked to answer the same question in their articles: capitalism, what has gone wrong, what needs to change, and how can it be fixed? That is precisely what each of the presenters in this webinar series will seek to answer. They'll each speak for about 15 minutes. There will then be a discussion with them for a further 15 minutes, and then we'll close the session. I'll now hand over to Paul Collier to introduce the speakers.
Thanks very much, Colin. So this session, this hour is at last going to be on Africa and how globalization has played out and can play out in Africa. We have got a superb lineup of expertise, but it has changed a little since the advertised program, because Vera Songwe, who's going to be alongside Celestin Monge, and unfortunately Vera, being the head of the Economic Commission for Africa, does not control her own time. And so this hour has been gobbled up by the United Nations. But we have replaced Vera Songwe for this session with Professor Stefan Durkheim. And so the lineup is now Celestin Monge will go first, Stefan Durkheim will go second, and the discussant will be Chris Adam. Now, anybody who's familiar at all with Africa, none of these people needs an introduction, but that is my job to introduce them. And so let me start with Celestin. Celestin, currently at Harvard, but the most amazing things about Celestin, he is amazing, is that he has straddled things. He has done a stellar academic career, Harvard, Paris, you name it. He's been at the most eminent academic institutions at a senior level, but he's also had equally eminent positions in public policy, a long and distinguished career at the World Bank, an important career at UNIDO, and a very important career at the African Development Bank, where he was chief economist. So this is a very, very distinguished person who has straddled the world of academic economics and public policy, as very few people have, but also he has managed to straddle two rather different but very important for Africa topics of economics. One of which has been industrialization, where he's worked very closely over the years with Justin Lin, and the other has been monetary policy and the question of monetary union, where he first studied with Rudiger Dornbusch, the great Rudiger Dornbusch, and has more recently been at the Bank for International Settlement. So this is an extraordinary person who's spanning the range of both of academia and public policy on two issues that are central to Africa's economic performance. So Celestin, it's great to have you here. Stefan Durkon, my colleague, my successor as the director of the Center for the Study of African Economies, also straddles. He straddles the Department of Economics, where he's a professor, and the Blavatnik School of Government, where he's professor. And he also straddles the world of academe and public policy. So alongside his job and jobs in the academic departments of Oxford University, he served as the chief economist for DFID, and more recently, as he's currently advisor, a very senior level in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, though he speaks to us entirely in his academic capacity. Nothing that he says today in any way reflects the views of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. As the discussant, we have a further very distinguished professor of economics and development at Oxford, Chris Adam, who's professor at the International Development Department in Oxford, and has again had a long career both in public policy and in academia. On that note, we could not have a finer panel to discuss the past play out of capitalism and the future prospects of capitalism in Africa. Celestin, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very, very much, Paul, and thank you, Colin. I feel blessed to be part of this conversation with Stefan Decken and Chris Adams, whom I've known since my student days. He was teaching assistant to Paul Collier in 1993, 1994, way back at Harvard. So, well, thank you. Let me share my screen, and then we can start. Okay. I hope you can all see my screen.
Yeah.
Well, I had this working title for myself just to make sure that I frame the issues the way I wanted them to be framed. But of course, this is part of a more deeper conversation, as Colin said in the introduction. So I won't be really getting into the semantics of what capitalism is and so on. Because this is just a small contribution in a broader discussion of the topic. Let me just say for reference that whenever I say capitalism in these next 10, 12 minutes, it will basically refer to the current dominant version of it, which we could think of as the American style capitalism, what it is and how it's been exported around the world and how it's been seen in Africa. So ideally, I would like to say four things. First, that capitalism has, of course, been generally a positive force around the world, but not all regions have really benefited from it. Again, capitalism, there are many nuances, many brands. Let's keep in mind that I'm thinking about the current dominant version, the American style. I think it's a system that is structurally prone to risk and which creates almost always inequities and social tensions. And I think that the secret of capitalism and the tools for its survival will have to include policies and strategies to limit or to mitigate these risks and to handle inequities and social tensions. And then, of course, I'm going to spend most time, hopefully, talking more about the African brands of that dominant version of capitalism, which really have been a failure. I think it's fair to say that in the African context, capitalism has not delivered as it has done in other parts of the world. And this has been compounded or aggravated by the context of authoritarianism that we all know in Africa, and frankly, by the poor leadership. It's very difficult to speak about capitalism in Africa in a vacuum without taking into account the political forces and the social forces and how the polity works in that context. And then if I have a minute or two at the end, I may say something about how I see policies and strategies to save and fix capitalism. So a mostly positive force throughout history. I think that even if you don't like capitalism, it's kind of hard to dispute it. And the evidence for this is the statistics put together by Angus Maddison, who, as you all know, looked carefully at 2,000 years of data on economic growth and per capita economic growth throughout the world, in all regions of the world. Of course, the obvious question is whether you can speak of, let's say, Cameroon today, as it was, that territory was 2,000 years ago, or even the United States for that matter, or any country. But I think that everybody who's looked carefully at Angus Maddison's work can say that he devoted his life doing his best to be consistent in drawing boundaries and coming up with these numbers, which are amazing. I put this chart up there, which I've done using Maddison's data, to make a simple point, which is that for really nearly 1,800 years, the entire world was poor. It's kind of shocking, and most people tend to forget this. If you measure income per capita in any place around the world 1,000 years ago, as Angus Maddison tried to do, and I think did, you would see that it was basically the same. It didn't matter where you were in the world. Of course, there were always rich people everywhere, but if you use the concept of per capita income and you measure it, you would see that there was democratization of poverty, if one could say so, for a very long time, until of course, the 1800s, something happened, and you can see on the charts. The small group of countries that really took off were the Western offshoots, and then the Western European countries. What happened there? The obvious answer is the Industrial Revolution. But Maddison is very strong in his work, arguing that it has been really the birth of modern capitalism, at least the version that we know today. And it has helped all countries in the world, not all countries, but many countries get into industrial upgrading, improving productivity, and then moving from low productivity activities like subsistence agriculture into light manufacturing, and then more sophisticated and higher value addition activities. And of course, the US is one of the best cases of what is viewed as successful industrial upgrading. Now, some countries in the past century, the past 70 years or so, have also done well. I pick South Korea because after World War II, South Korea was really a basket case, much in the situation of many African countries today, or even worse. If you go back and you look at South Korea's statistics in the 50s and then after the Korean War, well, things were really, really bad. But I would like to show a few pictures quickly, and then I'll spend the remainder of my time discussing Africa. This is a place in Seoul, a well-known place, which for many decades was a large agglomeration of slums. And then in the 1970s, they decided that they would do something about it. And there was a river, so they decided to remove the river and to kind of build a highway through and over the slums. This is the 1970s. This is the same place in the 1980s on the South Korean version of capitalism. You can see that they substantially improved the quality of of that place. The slums have disappeared. They remove even the river that was there, and then they build these highways as their own vision of their capitalism. And this is the same exact place a few years later, the same exact place where the mayor at the time, Mayor Lee Myung-bak, decided that it was time to bring back the river which they had diverted, and then make this place really friendly and as a symbol of South Korea having used capitalism wisely to create jobs, create wealth and prosperity, and even getting into sustainable growth and development. So it's an interesting example of how capitalism has worked well, I think, in some places. I can also show you this picture of Shenzhen. In the 1980s, Shenzhen was a sleepy small village of several thousand fishermen near Guangzhou, in Southeast China. This is a picture of the place in the 1980s, and this is the same exact place today. And again, you can see how the Chinese brand of capitalism, even though they don't call it capitalism, they call it socialism with Chinese characteristic. This is what they've done with taking into account using the system very well, globalization that Paul Collier talked about, and then bringing people into the process, being inclusive. When I say inclusion, I tend personally, because I'm a macroeconomist, to think mostly about good jobs. I think that the more good jobs you create and bring, that gives people possibilities and opportunities to improve their lives. Now, let me end this series of pictures by showing a couple of pictures of my own country, Cameroon, my beloved country, Cameroon. This is the capital city, Yaoundé, in the 1950s under colonial administration. Cameroon was not yet an independent country. This is a famous place in Yaoundé, the colonial market at the center of the capital city in the 50s. And this is the same exact place today. Of course, my point is that you don't see the kind of changes and transformation that the capitalism brought or was able to bring in other parts of the world there. And you can run this through many other African countries, and you would see the same non-transformation. And you can visually see that capitalism has not been mastered and used and exploited in the way that other countries have done. In fact, some people look at these pictures and they even say that on the colonial regime, the picture looked better than this one. I will not venture into that, but my point is capitalism has an Achilles heel that needs really seriously to be discussed and text. In the paper which I share, and I know the participant to this workshop, not the external audience, but the economists, the participants have received the draft. I go through a discussion of why I think that capitalism, even in the US, even in places where it has been successful, in recent decades has really lost its way a little bit. And I looked at the typical 5 pillars that advocates and proponents of capitalism put forward to justify, to make the case that it's still the best system in the world. I personally tend to agree that it's a bit like what Churchill said about democracy. It may not be the best, but everything else seems to be, for now, less worse. But what is capitalism and what is the degree of capitalism? We can go through that. But I won't spend time on this. Let me just say that I put these 5 pillars here simply to make the comment that even in the most advanced capitalist countries today, these pillars are under threat. Let me just pick competition, which is really at the core, the essence of capitalism. There's a lot of interesting, important work, including empirical work, done by people like Thomas Philippon, for instance, at New York University, showing that competition, the intensity of competition has decreased dramatically in the United States of America over the past decades, for instance. And those who strongly advocate for capitalism should certainly go through the criteria and see whether they are still valid as the way we think they should be. So let me go through this quickly. I also put up this chart, which I discussed in the paper a little bit, because to me it goes to the core of what's the fragility of capitalism. It is a system which is prone to shocks, to risk, because it encourages risk-taking. It encourages collaboration between the private sector and government. And when government work well, you may have some sense of good, neutral regulation taking place. But it's not always the case, not even in the most advanced economies. But the point here in this chart is that when there is a shock, like the pandemic that we are still going through, you have two types of reactions and possibilities between the poor and the non-poor. This is the dotted line on this graph just shows how the non-poor, can maintain their consumption even when there is a shock. They can do so because they typically have access to savings or to insurance or to other financial products, which makes them less vulnerable to shocks. Yes, the income may come down, which is the solid black line. At point A, there is a shock, the income comes down. And then they use their savings or some other means like insurance, and then they maintain their consumption. Unfortunately, you don't have that with the poor. The poor, which are represented, the story is at the bottom of this chart. When their income goes down, they simply don't have savings. They don't have access to credit. They don't have access to insurance. And then by the time there's a government policy response, if there is one that actually reaches them, well, some of the poor have actually been forced to sell their assets, to sell their most productive assets, which makes them worse off. Even when the policy response comes in, it's a bit too late because they already lost the means of production. So I think that's one of the biggest issues with the current version of capitalism. Its inability to help poor people deal with shocks and not be forced to sell the most productive asset. But let's end with Africa. As I said and hinted earlier when I showed the pictures of Cameroon and the lack of transformation, I think that Africa is the region of the world that has least benefited from capitalism. One reason, unfortunately, which we cannot avoid, is the weak public governance and the politics and the authoritarian regimes. Africa is still the place in the world where the international community seems to be okay, but that authoritarian rulers, some of them have been there for 3-4 decades in power, not delivering, not being accountable to anything, but still running the economy, running the system. They have their family members, their wives, their brothers, their nephews, their sons and daughters, and so on, their friends, who basically confiscate the national economy. It's very difficult for the people in Africa then, who, by the way, believe mainly, most of them, I think, believe in capitalism. In fact, one of my friends was even telling me that if you read the work of historians like Ibn Battuta, who came to sub-Saharan Africa even before the Westerners, that the people of Africa knew about capitalism and practiced capitalism before Adam Smith wrote his book. So it's a continent where people strongly believe in exchanges, in trade and finance, but when you have political system where there is no transparency and no accountability, it's very difficult to have the kind of capitalism that you've seen elsewhere delivering prosperity and social peace. Looking in particular to the market structure of capitalist system in Africa, The players are typically a few government officials, but with a weak administration. It's a kind of a paradox. You have 3-4 people who are basically on top of everything, and their signature, their word, the yes or no decides whether this industry gets this company gets a loan or not, or get the tax rate. Everything can be negotiated by a small group of people who set who make this decision. And then you have a very weak administration, and then with a strong people. You have some business people in that context who understand that in order to succeed, they need to be politically connected. So they establish, non-transparent relationship with people in power, and that changes everything. Unfortunately, the civil society part of business, which typically works well in other places, including in the United States, for instance, like the Chamber of Commerce, they don't work well in Africa, in most of Africa, because they are heavily politicized. Trade unions, which have worked well in Europe or in some other places to help capitalism function, are also politicized and weakened in most of Africa, I would say, except with the exception of South Africa, where, by the way, they may also be playing a very good role, but also in terms of maybe the wage bargaining discussion, not necessarily playing the role that would allow jobs to be created. You also have, of course, the dualism of the informality. You have a huge informal sector in almost everything. You have visible and invisible business entities. The competition is perhaps the point where Africa's brand of capitalism is the most peculiar. A lot of monopolies, a number of oligopolies, some of them visible, others not visible, in the sense that, in many African countries, if you're a business person and you get into a nice niche where you're making money, you know very quickly that some political people will come to you, and you will have to have them as shareholders or partners or else. And if that political person is the wife of the president or the brother of the president, well, you can imagine the kind of distortion that occurs. And of course, you cannot have competition, real competition, as we have in textbooks in places like that. So let me not take too much time, because I've already gone overboard. Maybe in 30 seconds, wrap up by saying that under Africa's branch of capitalism, the rules are very often unstable. The laws or regulations often outdated or uncertain. Sometimes the things which are in the books are not really what matters, including for judges, because they're not independent always. You have policy reversal. Government can decide something today and then change their mind the next day, because they decide this because they wanted to have an IMF loan or disbursement from the World Bank. And then a few weeks after they got it, then they go back and change their mind, and that changes everything. And of course, you have jobless Africa. I won't go through this graph, except to say that the blue lines are the percentages of people in Africa working in agriculture, whatever that is. Because they put statisticians in Africa tend to put in agriculture things that they cannot measure. But the point here is that most people in Africa, the labor force is constrained and trapped in really low productive activities, whether rural agriculture or informal activities in urban areas. And of course, you can have sustained growth and inclusive growth and poverty reduction with these kind of issues. Let me end with these 2-3 quick points to say that we cannot save capitalism in Africa if we don't think about the politics, about political governance, about transparency and accountability. And people like Roger Myson at the University of Chicago, the Nobel Prize winner, has been very strong when on his work on Africa in recent years with local governance, saying that it's really the way to build competition, to start competition by strong decentralization that works, allowing regional government, local government to have the kind of regional industrial policy, local industrial policy, for instance. I think that financing is also very important. We can go through that during the Q&A session. And then finally, last point, I think strongly that the creation of enclaves of excellence are essential, because the problems in Africa are so many, so pervasive, that it is almost impossible to any government to try to solve all of them at the same time. You would need, I don't know, 50 years to do all the reforms that the World Bank doing business identify for your country. The way to do it pragmatically and quickly is to create enclaves of excellence, that industrial district, special economic zone, industrial parks, and so on, which create the Marshallian externality and can help you build clusters and achieve economies of scale, which is good for foreign investors and also domestic investors. And then in a world where most of trade, certainly manufacturing, is being done through global value chain, it's critically important to find ways to connect Africans, SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, into global value chain, because otherwise you have political economy issues, and you have people, as I've seen in Democratic Republic of Congo, where the business community demonstrate on the streets against foreign investors, because they think that they are basically in bed with the politicians and that they are making money, but they are not building the economy. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I've been too long, Paul, but this is such an exciting topic.
Thank you very much, Celestin. That was great. So the way forward is devolved governance and pockets of excellence. And of course, pockets of excellence then get copied. Let's pass straight over to Stefan Durkon to pick the baton up. Stefan.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I have a few slides, and I will really do my best to talk much shorter. It was worth listening to Celestin, and I think what I will add to it, I think, is maybe trying on some of the things he was touching on, a bit of extra structure on it and a bit my take on it, and probably maybe also suggesting I do see pockets of change already. It's not just waiting for these pockets of excellence and actually focusing a bit more on that. So I'll explain the title will get clear a bit later on. But, you know, when Paul asked me quite late, it was only yesterday, to actually get involved in this conversation, the first thing I quickly did is actually, well, let me quickly go to the dictionary and to make sure that what I'm actually talking about actually makes sense in terms of what the concepts are. And, you know, this is what the Oxford Dictionary will tell you. And the three things in red are quite obvious. It's something to do with political economic system where the control of trade and where trade and industry are essentially controlled by private owners of profit rather than by the state. But it's what is quite important here is to realize that, you know, these writers of the Oxford Dictionary, they clearly have their own context in mind. They have their own structures in mind. And that actually is quite a striking thing that we see this here, because in somehow or another, even this statement, this definition tends to assume there is somehow a state sufficiently separate from private interest, some form of an accountable state that exists there. It's a bit like, you know, as if the state we describe here is a bit what North and Weingast and Wallis were calling, you know, an open access order, okay? And it's this assumption there is somehow that separate state allows then actually capitalism, where trade and industry are controlled by private owners and work for profit, can actually then kind of thrive. But in that system, even in an open access order, and they define it essentially almost as the words say, an order in society where entry is possible, where don't things get captured fundamentally beforehand, and where, whether it's in economics or in politics, people can enter and we get progress through that process. You know, there is an element of rules of the games that are defined here. Now, it is quite important that these things exist, and it will lead me later on and touching on some things that Celestin mentioned in terms of, you know, how to think of the African context here. Because, you know, it's not that there is no capitalist zeal, entrepreneurial zeal all over the world. In fact, there is enormous amounts of it in Africa. What possibly is different is somehow that nature of the order that exists there, because the zeal is there, you know, and we shouldn't forget, if an entrepreneur goes to bed at night and starts dreaming, the entrepreneur is probably not going to dream of, oh, I dream that it's perfect competition so that I can work as a small atomistic agent and everybody is equal and nobody can ever get power. An entrepreneur goes to bed at night and thinks, I'm going to dominate the market. I'm going to dominate. I'm going to be a big player in the game. I'm going to be defeat and kill off all my competitors. And so this is quite important to understand that, you know, the assumption that there is something there as an accountable state next to it is quite important. So this, if you don't think broadly speaking, you know, and I'm not going to try to give, and this is anyway so generalized, quite wrong, but if you think, you know, Western capitalism, in fact, American capitalism, as Celestin was referring to, you know, it went through these stages where, you know, where we had the age of national monopolies, when the robber barons came big in America, where initially there was a lot of liberalization, but then actually the reaction of the state was a way of correcting it. Then we had the age of managerial capitalism and also global capitalism later on emerging in it, where maybe the bounds were set nationally, but globally we're liberalizing in the whole state, thing. But where we again now get pressures of a correcting of the state towards it, but meanwhile, we're reaching the first part of the 21st century with possibly global oligopolies and monopolies. Think of what's happening in tech, and people saying, well, the bounds globally are not well put. Maybe nationally we have them, but globally or the national is not working anymore. Why I want to mention this is that the state all the time has been engaging during that period of success to find ways of correcting, error correcting by the state and finding ways of doing this. Now, if we think of why is this successful, it's not simply because capitalist zeal was unlocked, the entrepreneurs could go ahead and we could get capitalism to thrive, but there was also something in society where there is fundamentally that those with power and influence, whether it's in politics, business, military, civil society, have in the end a shared commitment that growth with some broader boundaries to it, call it development, that there is actually a shared commitment to it. That actually these rules of the game are a reflection of this shared commitment rather than anything else. And the way that we in richer society have been evolving and looking for these new, and in the end, you know, the way I would read Paul's book on the future of capitalism is about, you know, what would that nature be of that shared commitment going forward? What would that nature be? But another part that's quite important is you need the nature of a state of a particular type. You know, you need a state that is self-aware. This is not about being a big state or a small state, but it's actually that within the context, in that context of its own shared commitment, in its own reality, is actually quite self-aware, not doing too much or not doing too little. You know, we can't all, and that's an important thing, the whole world cannot be run like China, because we do not have all over the world 3,000 years of centralized civil service with taxation and so on. We have actually all kinds of contexts that we need to be aware of. And the state that is being self-aware is quite important. And I think actually the success of capitalism is that the state was quite self-aware, trying to find ways of correcting. Yes, it was all messy, but there was a form of error correction through political and bureaucratic means. And not just pure because there were elections, but much deeper ingrained that need for correction. Now, these three things, the shared commitment, a state that is quite self-aware, and error correction, it's probably helpful to actually go and have a look what's happening in Africa in recent times. And I would argue there is actually not just one little model, and maybe this is where I would want to have a discussion with Celestin, because I think it's not unique and everywhere the same, but you actually have these things that actually are playing out in different ways in different countries, which give me hope for some and actually no hope whatsoever for some others. Okay, I call this actually a growth and or development bargain. There is somehow an elite commitment to make it work and to actually get something that is a long-term horizon where we have that shared commitment to growth, where capitalism, or whatever form it will take, can function within it, whether it's the Chinese style in particular types of states, the Korean style, or indeed the Western style of it. Now, it's quite important now briefly to go back to the state, because you know, it is important, if we go back to that definition, to ask the question, well, who owns that state? To whom is it accountable? You know, and you can very easily change here the definition a little bit to something like an alternative definition. It's an economic and political system in which the country, state, and industry, as well as the state, are controlled by private owners for profit. Now, this is, I think, what Max Weber was talking about when he was talking about the patrimonial state. And this is probably what North means by the closed access state. It's totally captured as another extreme where the state is just controlled by the private owners for profit. And there is none of that kind of separation. I think that Celestin is alluding to, the lack of separation between the state and the business and so on. Now, one thing though that I want to then emphasize is that I don't believe, and I think North is unhelpful at times. I wouldn't dare to say this too much, but it's unhelpful by just saying either you're open or you're closed. And in fact, it's quite difficult for me to read some of these passages saying there's 30 countries that sorted it out and the rest is all a mess. I just don't think so. Even if you just think of those listening from the UK, what's happening today, you know, formal and informal structures of the state are all the time interacting, in this case, with text messages to the senior politicians. It's not as if, oh, it's all perfectly open or it's perfectly closed. All states are these mixtures. It's all about how far does this mixture go and does it tip the balance and get us actually going at some point. So in a sense, it's not a simple dichotomy as in North. Africa doesn't all have it, or indeed, as Acemoglu Robinson, who simplified, he took that and simplified entirely, inclusive versus exclusive institutions, and then saying, and it's all coming from history, where you basically, the only thing you can ever tell to a country, I'm very sorry, you should buy yourself a better history because that's the end of your destiny. And so surely there's something more. And what it ignores is actually the agency of the present-day elite. I don't like to just say it's the leaders, it's actually that elite. It's that broader group of people. They have acted, they can act, and that's what we see. We see African countries, at times it comes together, it may break down, it hasn't come together again, and we have good periods and so on. And in the final bit, I just want to give here a suggestion. This is where my animals come into it. And it's basically, you know, if we think of what are these elements to get capitalist or entrepreneurial zeal to work, you want probably something what is in the left-hand side there, these growth bargains, something that gives it that shared elite commitment, a self-aware state, and a format of error correction within your system. Now, you know, building on the work by Weber, Christopher Clapham, the brilliant economic historian and political scientist, talked about neo-patrimonial state. It becomes this perceived thing that political scientists talk about it. It's basically where you say, well, the formal and informal structures are so interwoven that you're not quite sure what you see. And when you look at it, you may see the formal structures of an election, of a parliament and so on. And Celestin was alluding to the courts in that respect. But then underneath it is this massive big thing that you don't really see. This is why I call it the hippostates, because you only see the ears and you don't really see the rest of the body floating there in the river. So in fact, there's an expression in Afrikaans, you only see the hippo ears. That is literally means you only see the tip of the iceberg. And it's quite natural that also in Sierra Leone and other African countries, we get that expression. There's no icebergs in Africa, icebergs in Africa. So it's basically neo-patrimonial. And if you think of it, it's possible that elite may well want to do it. The state, though, is just harder to function because that nature of that state with all that informal network is always easily captured by clientelism and patronage. Error correction happens, but usually with the help of outside forces, bring in the IMF or something. Through a crisis, you have to do it. You just do not have these self-correcting forces. So I would say in recent times, Sierra Leone and Malawi, it doesn't really look good and you basically don't get much. But I would say with the constitutional reform in Kenya, it's a patrimonial state, no doubt, or neo-patrimonial state. But by decentralizing, pick it up the Mayerson point, decentralizing corruption by having constitutional reform, that actually it's not just one bite that you can have, you know, you can have your time to eat even if you lose the national elections, you can actually go down. Think of Uganda under the early parts of Museveni, it's probably watered down a bit, but you know, the man wanted to be there forever, so that was really had to have a long term, and he was willing to listen to Paul and other people with all the advice. Or think of Ghana, finding a political system that at least brings in a correction mechanism that takes that all the time out of the picture. Okay, so that's one group. But you do have states that are looking a bit more like tigerfish. You know, I like the tigerfish. It reminded me of, there was the prime minister of Congo at the time, Ponyo, told me, said, we want to be a tiger. And I don't know why I had the wit to say it, I think you rather are a tiger fish, because if you look up in the dictionary what is a tiger fish, it's a fish that lives of eating little fish and it swims in the Congo River. So that's basically the only thing it does. And it's basically where a state, there's no shared commitment, it's predation, clientelism. Nigeria moves between hippos and tiger fish and so on, and it can all break down dramatically to the thing. You could also try to do it on this kind of state-led type of thing, and that's the final thing I want to say, is maybe a bit more like these lions, you know, Rwanda, Ethiopia. There is a shared elite commitment. Maybe the only problem is that the elite is pretty small because they kept an awful lot of groups out. And that gives it a bit of a question mark. But if you look at East Asia, that's probably how it started. It definitely can actually do a much more self-aware state, and it definitely tries to do some of these corrections. Error correction, though, and we see this in Ethiopia, which makes it a bit tricky, regime change and so on is hard to handle. And indeed, the current regime clearly saw that it had to open up the economy because the state is not so strong to keep totally controlling, but of course politics is there as well. And I would say Tanzania thought it was going to be a line under Nyerere, but was a total failure. Anyway, this is kind of thing. But it, for me, what's to suggest is these are all mixtures of this kind of formal and informal, these mixtures of this open and closed access order that tries to find ways of evolving. And I think it actually gets us something there. It also tells us, and that's the real final slide, what to do. Well, what is it that we can do to get a shared elite commitment to maybe work better? As outsiders, can we improve the chances of a success of this elite? Can we actually get that state being more self-aware? I believe strongly in having the pocket of excellence in central banks and so on to help also with the error correction. And this is one of the big improvements we've had. Anyway, and this is essentially trying to get towards more a growth and development bargain. Of course, it's all very hard. And that's a bit like, you know, all of this is a gamble for the elite to, rather than go for short-term rent sharing, to actually go for something more for the long run with more pain and gain in the short run. And that actually makes it so hard, which is also why I think it is very much about, can we help the odds of these gambles in the future? And so, yeah, anyway, so I've written something about it, but it will come out soon.
Stefan, thank you very much indeed. That was another fascinating and superb presentation. So, Chris, you've got the unenviable task of trying to respond and into these two superb and stimulating presentations. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Celestin and Stefan. Two great presentations. And certainly in the kind of 6.5 minutes I've got, not an opportunity to summarize them in any great detail. On a practical level, let me say, Celestin, that I'll make a few comments on the presentation and the paper, but I will give you sort of full written up comments on your paper in due course. I think the first thing that I would say is that there's a lot of complementarity here between the two presentations and a lot of opportunity, I think, for you in your Oxford paper, Celestin, to draw on some of the stuff that Stefan has presented. Because I think reading your paper and listening to the presentation, there's an awful lot of common ground there that can, I think, can be developed. I think this characterization of shared commitment, self-awareness and error correction is actually quite a useful framework to wrap around a number of the issues that you raised in your paper as well, Celestin. Let me pick up on, I guess, one point that I wanted to reflect on in your presentation, Celestin, and then turn it back to the two of you with 3 questions. And the observation is a statement that you make in a number of places about the kind of intrinsic characteristic of capitalism to generate risk and uncertainty for societies. And it seems to me that there's a lot more to that. There's an important to distinguish between, in a sense, those shocks and risks that are intrinsic to the system, that are generated by the nature of the system. You talked about a system that encourages risk-taking, for example. From the capacity of the system to respond to shocks that originate from outside. And I think this is particularly true in the African setting. And for those two types of kind of risk and shock, to think about over what horizons they manifest themselves. Is at some point you're talking about kind of deep kind of centrifugal pressures in the system that lead to divergence, that lead to inequality, that lead to these sharp distinctions between those that can accumulate and those that can't. And sometimes the issue is about short-term shocks and the management of short-term shocks. And I guess we're lucky this afternoon to have Paul chairing this, because in a sense, one of the great natural experiments that probably all three of us started out our careers reading about was the controlled open economy story, about the way in which, in the distinction between Kenya and Tanzania in response to a terms of trade shock that was exogenous to both economies, how different systems responded to the same shock differentially. And that's a case where, in a sense, the properties of the system are about risk mitigation and risk response, as opposed to being the generator of underlying pressures towards divergence. I think drawing that out in your paper might be quite a useful thing to do. But let me move to where I think you, in the paper, I think you kind of hid your light under a bushel somewhat. And that is the final section, where you introduce in the paper, and then because of the shortage of time in the presentation, rather quickly at the end about what in the paper you call sort of structural economic policies, or that's not the right phrase. You call it the new structural economics. And that is central to your argument about the resurrection in your title. There's a lot in the obituary part, which I think everybody will agree with. The resurrection stuff is where the really interesting part of the paper comes in, but I think you do yourself a disservice by not expanding that nearly as much as you could. And this, what I'm going to say, picks up a little bit on what Stefan said in his opening remarks, is that actually at some level you're demonstrating quite a lot of confidence in the system as it currently exists. You describe, for example, the role of external agency. You've got a quote that says, "This is our best hope of mobilizing resources at the global level to support sub-Saharan Africa." The kind of the IFI structures, the multilateral development banks, the existing structures, you argue are well placed to be the principal mobilizer of resources. I'd like to see that argument developed a little bit more. If they are quite so successful, what are the challenges they're facing now? Why do we not see the resource flow that you are arguing is required? And then the second issue, as I say, is I think you want to really say a lot more about, in a sense, what the new structural economics brings to the diagnosis of the current challenges of capitalism in Africa, and the prognosis in terms of the kind of specifics of intervention, both at the domestic and the regional level, that will help to address some of the deep tensions that you've identified. And let me finish with a couple of questions for both of you, which pick up a little bit from Stefan's presentation. And that's to explore a little bit further the dynamics of this typology. That we've got our kind of hippos, tigerfish, lion. Where do the kind of graduating hippos and the graduating lions, where do they move and how do they move, and to what extent, and I think you touched on it towards the end, Stefan, that to what extent does success undermine the shared interest? To what extent does success challenge the error correction mechanisms? And you started to talk a little bit about that in the context of Ethiopia, that the recognition that, in a sense, to maintain the resource inflow requires certain actions that arguably change the dynamics of the I was going to call it the encompassing interest, but the self-interest of the elite, and threatens that that security. It's 2:59, Paul. I'll stop there. There's lots more I could say, but maybe there's a minute or two for Celestin and Stefan to respond quickly.
I think there is, but Celestin, you've had a lot of questions thrown at you, and you've got the whole of 2 minutes to answer them, so you might be a little selective.
Certainly. No, I will first thank Chris for his comments and thoughts. I've benefited from these comments for many years. I remember when I was at the African Development Bank as Vice President Chief Economist, I would never put out a macroeconomic report without getting a written comment from Chris Adams. On what macro chapter. So very thoughtful, interesting comment. Let me just pick maybe one, since you insisted on that one. What would the new structural economics bring to the current discussion of capitalism in Africa? Well, to me, one of the reasons, I mean, there are many reasons why Africa hasn't done very well in terms of digesting capitalism. I mean, I listed a few of them. But at the practical level, we have tried in Africa to copy very often the wrong models. If you're the Prime Minister of Burundi and you think of yourself as a landlocked country, you pick a successful landlocked country like Switzerland, and then you say, let me get their institution, their policies, and so on. Well, the banking system or the financial market in Switzerland may not be appropriate for Burundi, given its current level of development. I think that new structural economics bring this conversation on the model, the appropriateness of policies and strategies based on the current level of development really into focus. And then second thing, and then I'll end there. By definition, low-income countries have very limited resources. Even advanced economies have very limited resources. Low-income countries. So you need to be extraordinarily strategic in the way you use your resources, whether they are financial resources or human resources. And so on. And by trying to do everything at the same time, not privatizing and picking, industries and sectors randomly by politicians or by whoever business person is politically connected, doesn't help. What you need to do is weave the private sector, finding the niches where your endowment structure, labor capital ratio makes you more competitive, and then finding the niche where you can really be a force. And then if you have the economies of scale through regionalization in Africa, producing across boundaries, national boundaries and so on, then your market is a global market. You can be Burundi, but your market is not the market of Burundi, it's a global market. And I think that new structural economics also helps make that conversation more focused. But thank you very much for all your comments. That will be very, very useful as I revise the paper.
Thank you, Celestin. Stefan, 1 minute.
Yes, I'll try in a minute, yes. So thank you, Chris. And that's an excellent point. I mean, you're absolutely right that shared commitment needs to hold. And so you need to find a way that this actually is, let's say, in game theory, a short-term, but also a long-term equilibrium, that it is a stable equilibrium in that sense. And so this is actually probably why I'm arguing here also, is that, that the whole economic deal that exists and the political deal need to be consistent with each other. I just find it striking. Let me give 3 very quick examples. One is, if you think in China, when Deng Xiaoping was opening up the economy, there was an incredible political gamble. If you now look at the records, who argued very strongly for the repression during Tiananmen Square, it was Deng Xiaoping. And so he had to keep that political deal together at all costs. And at all costs that's the only way that the economic deal could work. The reverse is also, think of Indonesia, which I find a really interesting example here, is that during the early 2000s after the Asian crisis with the transition, you needed to find a way to keep the old elite in it. Now, one person who never really got pushed out was Madame 10 cents, Madame 10 cents, you know, this was the wife of Suharto, who always took 10% on all infrastructure programs. That is the old elite, while there's a new incumbent elite coming in there at the same time. You need to keep on working that. And in Indonesia, it had to be solved by actually allowing them to be paid off. This is a bit like in Ethiopia, where I want to allude to, is to saying, you know, in these lion states, the underlying shared commitment is unfortunately held by a very small elite. Yep. And indeed, one that came to power in one day in Ethiopia, representing a minority interest. They may have tried, but actually just economic progress doesn't usually buy enough legitimacy. And we, you know, I'd hoped it didn't come to that, but that's also what's there. And you need to have that political and economic deal working together. So what you do about it is also a bit like towards us. We focus all the time about de-risking economic progress, de-risking the economy and so on. Need to find ways of de-risking the politics as well, because actually these two things will come together.
Thank you, all three of you. It's been a great session. Let me summarize in 1 minute that there's been too much attention on the dream of the perfect long term, the replication of Switzerland, the instant replication. All these are transitions starting from fragility, starting from very low capacity. And the transitions have to work step by step, starting from where you are with the capacities you've got, and they have to work every step of the way. The path to the long-term goal is the success at every moment of the short term. But on that note, thank you very much. We've had a fantastically good session. And thank you as an audience for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Paul.